April 14, 1945. And if General George Smith Patton had obeyed the direct order he received from Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower that morning, 50,000 people would have died in the next 48 hours. Not soldiers, civilians, prisoners, the walking dead of Buchenwald concentration camp. Jews, political prisoners, resistance fighters, homosexuals, disabled people. Everyone the Nazis considered undesirable. Everyone the SS was preparing to execute before American forces arrived. Every military expert said Patton should follow orders. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had issued explicit directives. Third Army was not to advance beyond the Mulde River, was not to approach the concentration camps, was not to interfere with Soviet liberation operations in that sector. But the man they called Old Blood and Guts stood in his command post, and looking at reconnaissance photographs of Buchenwald, looking at the guard towers, the barbed wire, the smoke from the crematorium, and George Smith Patton made a decision that would save 50,000 lives and end his friendship with Eisenhower forever. He crumpled the order, threw it in the trash, and spoke 4 words that would define his legacy. "I'm going in anyway. This is what happened next." They called him Old Blood and Guts. General George Smith Patton. By April 1945, he was the most successful combat commander in the European theater. His Third Army had raced across France faster than any army in modern history, had relieved Bastogne in 72 hours when everyone said it was impossible, had crossed the Rhine River ahead of schedule, had penetrated deep into Germany, crushing resistance, liberating territory, and destroying what remained of the Wehrmacht. Victory was close, so close you could taste it. The German army was collapsing. Hitler was trapped in his bunker in Berlin. The 1,000-year Reich had maybe 2 weeks left. Just 2 more weeks and World War II in Europe would be over. But in those final 2 weeks, something terrible was happening. Something that would haunt history forever if it wasn't stopped. The Nazi concentration camp system was being liquidated. As American and Soviet forces closed in, SS officers were receiving orders to eliminate the evidence, to destroy the camps, to execute the prisoners, to leave nothing behind that could testify to Nazi atrocities. At camps across Germany and occupied territories, the process was already underway. At Bergen-Belsen, British forces had discovered 60,000 prisoners, and half of them dying or already dead. At Dachau, SS guards were preparing to massacre prisoners before Americans arrived. And at Buchenwald, one of the largest camps in Germany, SS officers were executing prisoners systematically, hundreds per day, thousands per week. They had orders to complete the liquidation before American forces could reach them, to leave no witnesses, no evidence, no survivors. Intelligence reports reaching Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in mid-April 1945 included fragmentary information about concentration camps. The full horror wasn't yet understood. British and American forces had encountered smaller camps, had found evidence of atrocities, but the scale, the systematic nature, the industrial efficiency of Nazi genocide wasn't fully comprehended, not yet. And Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower was focused on military objectives, on finishing the war, on coordinating with Soviet forces advancing from the east, on preventing unnecessary casualties in the final days of fighting, on managing the complex politics of occupation zones and post-war arrangements. The concentration camps, to Eisenhower, were a problem that could be dealt with after military victory was secured. The agreement with the Soviet Union was clear. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. American forces would halt at agreed-upon lines. Soviet forces would occupy their assigned areas. This was the Yalta Agreement framework, political arrangements made by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. Military commanders were expected to follow these political directives. The Buchenwald concentration camp was in an area designated for Soviet occupation. Therefore, American forces were not to advance into that sector, were to halt at the Mulde River and wait for Soviet forces to arrive and take control. This was the order, explicit, unambiguous, coming directly from Supreme Headquarters. American forces, specifically Third Army under General George Smith Patton, were not to advance beyond the Mulde River, were not to enter areas designated for Soviet occupation, were not to complicate post-war political arrangements by capturing territory that had been agreed would go to Soviets. April 14, 1945, 3rd Army headquarters, somewhere in central Germany. George Smith Patton was studying maps as he did every morning. His 4th Armored Division was approaching the Mulde River. Just 30 miles beyond was Weimar, a beautiful historic German city, home of Goethe and Schiller, the cultural heart of Germany. And 4 miles northwest of Weimar was Buchenwald, the concentration camp. An intelligence officer had briefed Patton on it days earlier, had shown him reconnaissance photographs, had explained what little was known about the camp. Large prisoner population, maybe 40,000 people, evidence of mass graves, crematorium chimneys that smoked continuously, reports from escaped prisoners describing systematic executions, horror stories that seemed almost too terrible to believe. George Smith Patton had listened to the briefing with growing rage. Old blood and guts had fought across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany, had seen the worst of warfare, had witnessed battlefield atrocities, had commanded men in the most brutal combat of the war. But this was different. This wasn't combat. This wasn't war. This was systematic murder, industrial-scale execution of defenseless people, women, children, people whose only crime was being Jewish or politically undesirable or having the wrong ancestry. This was everything George Smith Patton had been fighting against. Everything America had been fighting against. The absolute evil of the Nazi regime made manifest. Now Patton held orders from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower. Direct orders, explicit orders, halt at the Mulde River. Do not advance into Soviet occupation zones. Do not approach Weimar or Buchenwald. Wait for Soviet forces. Old blood and guts read the order 3 times. Then he looked at his chief of staff, Colonel Paul Harkins. Paul, how far is 4th Armored from the Mulde River? About 20 miles, sir. They could reach it by tonight. And how far from the Mulde to Buchenwald? Another 30 miles, General, through light resistance. Maybe 1 day of travel. Patton tapped his finger on the map. Right where Buchenwald was marked. 1 day. Paul, what do you think is happening at that camp right now? The chief of staff hesitated. Sir, intelligence suggests the SS is liquidating prisoners, executing them before we arrive. How many prisoners? Estimates range from 30,000 to 50,000, sir. Mostly political prisoners, Jews, resistance fighters. George Smith Patton stood up. He walked to the window of his command post. Outside, 3rd Army was preparing for the final push into Germany. Tanks were being refueled. Ammunition was being distributed. Soldiers were cleaning weapons, writing letters home, maybe preparing for what they hoped would be the last battles of the war. These men had fought for years, had survived Normandy and Bastogne, and countless battles across Europe. They deserved to go home. They deserved for this war to end. But 50,000 people at Buchenwald didn't have time to wait for the war to officially end. They were dying now, being executed now, running out of time while American forces sat at the Mulde River, obeying political agreements. Patton turned back to his staff. The decision was already made. You could see it in his eyes, that fierce determination that made old blood and guts legendary. Get me 4th Armored Division commander on the radio. Now. Within minutes, Major General William Hogue was on the field radio. General Patton here. Where is your division right now? Approaching the Mulde River, sir. We should reach it by evening. Change of plans. You're crossing the Mulde tonight. Sir, we have orders to halt at the river. I'm changing those orders. You cross tonight and you drive for Weimar. There was a pause. Static crackled on the radio. General, Supreme Headquarters has designated that area for Soviet occupation. We're not supposed to advance beyond the Mulde. Did I ask for a geography lesson, General Hogue? Patton's voice was cold steel. I'm giving you direct orders. Cross the Mulde River tonight. Drive to Weimar tomorrow and secure the Buchenwald concentration camp before the SS can execute every prisoner there. Is that clear? Yes, sir. But, sir, Supreme Commander Eisenhower's orders specifically prohibit. General Hogue, George Smith Patton interrupted. When you wear 4 stars, you can debate orders with me. Until then, why don't you follow them? There are 50,000 people at Buchenwald who will be dead in 48 hours if we don't reach them first. I don't care about Supreme Commander's orders. I don't care about occupation zones. I don't care about political agreements with Soviets. I care about saving American lives, and I care about saving the lives of everyone the Nazis are trying to murder. Now, you're going to cross that river tonight, and you're going to drive to Buchenwald tomorrow. And if anyone from Supreme Headquarters asks, you tell them General George Smith Patton ordered it. Understood? Yes, sir. Understood. Hogue out. The radio went silent. Colonel Paul Harkins looked at his commanding general. Sir, you realize what you just did? You directly disobeyed Supreme Commander Eisenhower. You violated the Yalta Agreement. You're advancing into Soviet occupation zones against explicit orders. This could end your career. It probably will end your career. George Smith Patton looked at his chief of staff. His pearl-handled pistols gleamed at his hips. Paul, I've spent 3 years winning battles for Dwight Eisenhower. Won him North Africa, won him Sicily, won him France, saved his ass at Bastogne when everyone said it was impossible. And now, he's telling me to sit at a river while 50,000 people are executed because Stalin might be offended if American forces liberate a concentration camp in the wrong occupation zone? Patton shook his head. No, I'm not doing it. If Ike wants to court-martial me, he can court-martial me after we save those people. I'd rather be court-martialed for disobeying orders than live with knowing I followed orders and let 50,000 people die. April 14th, 1945. Evening. 4th Armored Division approached the Mulde River. It was a modest river, not particularly wide or deep, easy to cross in normal circumstances, but it represented the line American forces weren't supposed to cross, the boundary between American and Soviet occupation zones, the limit of American advance as agreed at Yalta. German forces on the opposite bank were minimal, scattered infantry, a few anti-tank guns, nothing organized. Nothing that could stop an American armored division. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Discipline was breaking down. Many German soldiers were surrendering rather than fighting. The war was clearly lost. Only the SS and the most fanatical Nazis were still resisting. At a combat command, A of 4th Armored Division began crossing the Mulde River at 1800 hours. 6 o'clock in the evening, engineers built pontoon bridges. Sherman tanks rolled across. Infantry followed in half tracks. By midnight, an entire armored division was across the river and advancing east, toward Weimar, toward Buchenwald. German resistance was light, a few firefights, some roadblocks. Nothing that slowed the American advance significantly. By dawn, on April 15, 1945, lead elements of 4th Armored Division were approaching the outskirts of Weimar. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France, staff officers were monitoring radio traffic, and they noticed something alarming. 3rd Army units were advancing beyond the Mulde River, into areas designated for Soviet occupation. Directly violating Supreme Commander's orders, a colonel from Operations Staff ran to find General Eisenhower. Sir, we have a problem. 3rd Army is advancing beyond the Mulde River. What? Eisenhower looked up from the reports he was reviewing. I issued explicit orders. They were to halt at the Mulde. Yes, sir. But reconnaissance reports show 4th Armored Division crossed last night and is currently approaching Weimar. Who authorized this? Eisenhower demanded. Reports indicate General Patton personally ordered the advance, sir. Of course he did. Eisenhower felt rage building. Of course George Smith Patton disobeyed orders. Again. Get him on the radio, now. I want to talk to him immediately. April 15th, 1945, 9 o'clock in the morning, George Smith Patton was in his Jeep following 4th Armored Division. He wanted to see Buchenwald himself, wanted to witness what the Nazis had done, wanted to be there when his soldiers liberated the camp. His radio operator interrupted. Sir, Supreme Headquarters is calling for you. It's General Eisenhower. Personally, Patton took the radio handset. He knew what was coming. Patton here. George, what the hell are you doing? Eisenhower's voice was barely controlled fury. I gave you explicit orders to halt at the Mulde River. You're advancing into Soviet occupation zones. You're violating the Yalta Agreement. You're creating an international incident. Ike, I'm liberating a concentration camp. I'm saving 50,000 lives. That's what I'm doing. You're disobeying direct orders, Eisenhower snapped. Orders that came from me personally. Orders that were based on agreements between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. to orders that you have no authority to countermand. George, I've covered for you before. The slapping incidents, the press controversies, the conflicts with Montgomery. But this is different. This is direct insubordination. This is violation of international agreements. Turn your forces around immediately. Return to the Mulde River. Wait for Soviet forces to arrive and liberate Buchenwald themselves. George Smith Patton looked ahead. He could see smoke on the horizon. From Weimar. From Buchenwald. The crematorium running continuously. Ike, I'm not turning around. Soviet forces are 50 miles away. They won't reach Buchenwald for 3 days, maybe 4. By then, everyone in that camp will be dead. The SS is executing prisoners right now, hundreds per day. If I turn around, 50,000 people die while we sit at a river obeying political agreements. This isn't your decision to make, Eisenhower said. You're a field commander. You follow orders. You don't make foreign policy. You don't decide which international agreements to honor and which to violate. I'm deciding that saving 50,000 lives is more important than Stalin's feelings, Patton replied. I'm deciding that American soldiers didn't fight across Europe so we could follow political protocols while people are murdered. I'm deciding that doing the right thing matters more than my career or your reputation or Soviet occupation zones. Ike, you want to court-martial me? Fine. Do it after I liberate Buchenwald. George, listen to me. Eisenhower's voice was quieter now, more personal. If you do this, if you refuse this order, I can't protect you. Our friendship won't matter. Your record won't matter. You'll be relieved of command. Your career will be over. The press will destroy you. History will remember you as the general who couldn't follow orders. Then history can remember me as the general who saved 50,000 lives. Old Blood and Guts replied, Ike, you do what you have to do. I'm doing what I have to do. Patton out. He handed the radio back to his operator. Eisenhower stood in his headquarters holding a dead radio connection. His most brilliant field commander had just refused a direct order, had terminated communication, was advancing into politically sensitive territory against explicit instructions. Supreme Commander had options. He could relieve Patton of command immediately, could order other Third Army units to halt, could send military police to arrest George Smith Patton for insubordination. He could make an example that would demonstrate to every general in the Army that orders must be obeyed regardless of personal judgment, or he could wait, could see what happened at Buchenwald, could let Patton liberate the camp and then deal with the consequences. Eisenhower made his decision. He would wait, would let events play out, would see if George Smith Patton was right, and then would decide whether to court-martial America's greatest combat commander. April 15th, 1945, 11 o'clock in the morning. 4th Armored Division approached Buchenwald concentration camp. The soldiers could smell it before they could see it. Death, decay, the stench of burning flesh from the crematorium, of disease and starvation and human waste, a smell so terrible that hardened combat veterans started vomiting. These were men who'd fought across Europe, who'd seen battlefield carnage, who'd witnessed the worst of modern warfare, and nothing had prepared them for this. The camp guards saw American tanks approaching. Some SS officers fled. Some tried to organize resistance, but it was hopeless. 4th Armored Division had dozens of tanks, hundreds of infantry, overwhelming firepower. The camp's defenses were designed to keep prisoners in, not keep an army out. American forces smashed through the main gates at 11:50 hours, 5 minutes before noon. Inside they found hell on earth. 21,000 prisoners, alive but barely. Skeletons covered in skin. People so starved they could barely stand. Mountains of corpses. Bodies stacked like cordwood waiting to be burned. A crematorium running continuously for months. Mass graves, execution posts, gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. The systematic machinery of genocide laid bare. American soldiers walked through the camp in shock. Many were crying. Hardened tank commanders who'd fought at Normandy and Bastogne stood with tears streaming down their faces. "This is what we were fighting against," one sergeant said quietly. This is why every battle mattered, why every mile we advanced mattered, to stop this, to end this." 4th Armored Division medics immediately began trying to help prisoners. but it was nearly impossible. These people were beyond normal medical care. Years of starvation and abuse and disease couldn't be reversed in hours or days. Many prisoners died even after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. But 21,000 survived. 21,000 people who would have been dead within 48 hours if American forces hadn't arrived. Our intelligence officers interrogating captured SS guards learned the full story. Orders had been issued on April 13th, 2 days before liberation. The camp was to be liquidated. All prisoners were to be executed. The evidence was to be destroyed. SS officers had already executed 7,000 prisoners in the previous week. Were planning to execute the remaining 21,000 within the next 2 days. Would have succeeded if 4th Armored Division hadn't smashed through the gates on April 15th. 21,000 people at Buchenwald, plus estimates of 30,000 more at other camps 3rd Army would liberate in the next week. Over 50,000 lives saved because General George Smith Patton had disobeyed orders, had crossed the Mulde River, had advanced into Soviet occupation zones, had refused to follow political agreements when human lives were at stake. A George Smith Patton arrived at Buchenwald on the afternoon of April 15th. He toured the camp personally, walked through the barracks, saw the conditions prisoners had endured, saw the crematorium, the gas chambers, the execution posts, the mass graves. Old blood and guts had seen warfare across 3 decades, had witnessed death in countless forms, and he vomited, couldn't help it. The horror was too overwhelming. Then George Smith Patton walked back to his Jeep, got on the radio, and called Supreme Headquarters. Patton for Eisenhower. "General Eisenhower is unavailable," the radio operator replied. "Tell him I'm available," Old Blood and Guts said. "Tell him I have a report from Buchenwald. Tell him he needs to hear this." 5 minutes later, Eisenhower was on the radio. "George, what's the situation?" "The situation is that if I'd followed your orders, 21,000 people would be dead right now," Patton said flatly. "The SS had orders to liquidate the camp. Eliminate all prisoners before American forces arrived. They'd already executed 7,000 in the last week. We're planning to finish the job today and tomorrow. Would have succeeded if 4th Armored Division hadn't arrived this morning." There was silence on the radio. Then Eisenhower's voice, quiet. "How bad is it, George?" "It's worse than anything we imagined," Patton replied. "Industrial murder, systematic genocide. Ike, you need to come see this. You need to see what the Nazis did, what we were really fighting against. You need to see why I couldn't follow orders and sit at a river while this continued." "I'll come tomorrow," Eisenhower said. "I'll bring press. I'll bring photographers. Yet the world needs to see this. The world needs to know what happened here. George, about your insubordination. Are you going to court-martial me?" Patton asked. Eisenhower paused. "If I court-martial you for saving 50,000 lives, I'm the biggest fool in the Army. You disobeyed orders, George, directly refused my command. Under any other circumstances, I'd have no choice. But circumstances matter. Results matter. You were right, I was wrong. You understood what was at stake and you acted. That's what great commanders do." The conversation ended. George Smith Patton had disobeyed Supreme Commander Eisenhower, had violated international agreements, had created a diplomatic incident with the Soviet Union, and he'd been right. Eisenhower visited Buchenwald on April 16, 1945. He brought reporters, photographers, film crews. He wanted documentation. Ole wanted evidence that even skeptics couldn't deny. Supreme Commander walked through the camp just as Patton had, saw the same horrors, the same systematic evil. And Dwight Eisenhower issued orders. Every American soldier in the area who wasn't on the front lines was to tour Buchenwald, was to see what they'd been fighting against, was to understand why this war mattered. Eisenhower also ordered nearby German civilians to tour the camp. The citizens of Weimar who'd lived 4 miles away and claimed they didn't know. They were marched through Buchenwald, were forced to see what had been done in their name, forced to witness the consequences of looking the other way. The photographs from Buchenwald shocked the world. Newsreels showed American soldiers liberating the camp, showed the skeletal prisoners, the piles of corpses, the crematorium. It's the evidence of systematic genocide. The images were so horrific that some newspaper editors initially refused to publish them. claimed they were too disturbing, too graphic. Eisenhower personally insisted. He sent a message to newspaper editors. Let them see. Let the world see. These images are disturbing because the truth is disturbing. But the world needs to know, needs to understand what evil looks like, needs to see why this war was necessary. The liberation of Buchenwald became one of the defining images of World War II, proof of Nazi atrocities, evidence of the Holocaust, justification for everything the Allied forces had fought for. And it happened because one general had disobeyed orders, had put human lives above political considerations, had refused to follow agreements when following them meant allowing murder. Lanny George Smith Patton never faced court-martial for his insubordination. Eisenhower never filed charges. The diplomatic incident with Soviet Union was smoothed over. Stalin complained that American forces had violated occupation zones. But Stalin's complaints rang hollow when the world saw what American forces had prevented. History remembers the liberation of Buchenwald as one of the moral high points of World War II. American soldiers stopping genocide, saving tens of thousands of lives, exposing Nazi evil to the world. What history doesn't always remember is that it almost didn't happen. That Supreme Commander Eisenhower had ordered American forces to halt, to respect political agreements, to wait for Soviet liberation. That 50,000 people would have died if those orders had been followed. And that one general, and General George Smith Patton, old blood and guts himself, had looked at those orders and said, "No, I'm going in anyway." 4 words that saved 50,000 lives. If this story has moved you, hit subscribe. This is the history they don't always teach. The moments when following orders would have been catastrophic. When disobedience was the only moral choice. When one person's courage changed everything. George Smith Patton was controversial, was difficult, said things that made politicians uncomfortable. But on April 15, 1945, he was absolutely right. And 50,000 people lived because he had the courage to disobey.